In 1980, an archaeological team pulled a 3,800-year-old mummy from the sand of China's Taklamakan desert. She had reddish-brown hair, stood nearly 6 feet tall, and was dressed in a carefully stitched wool cloak. By every physical measure, she looked European. She had been buried 4,000 miles from Europe in one of the most inaccessible deserts on Earth. And she was not alone. The Taklamakan Desert covers roughly 130,000 square miles in what is now China's Xinjiang region. Its name translates from Uyghur as something close to "you go in, you don't come out." Annual rainfall is less than half an inch, summer temperatures exceed 100 degrees Fahrenheit, and winter nights fall well below zero. By any rational measure, this is not where you expect to find a thriving ancient civilization. Yet someone had been living here and dying here for millennia. The first hints surfaced not through formal archaeology, but through Swedish explorer Sven Hedin, whose Central Asian expeditions in the early 20th century mapped parts of the Tarim Basin and its dried lake beds. In 1934, expedition member Folke Bergman recorded precise coordinates for a desert cemetery marked by unusual wooden poles before political upheaval sealed the entire region to outside researchers. Those coordinates would sit in a Stockholm archive for nearly 70 years before anyone could follow them back. The mummy found near the ghost city of Loulan was studied carefully after her 1980 discovery. She had died at roughly 45 years of age, sometime around 1800 BCE. Her felt hat still held a feather tucked into the brim, and her woolen cloak was stitched with evident skill. Scientists named her the Beauty of Loulan, but her real significance was not her appearance. She was the first confirmed evidence of a population that had been hiding in the desert for millennia and whose identity no one could explain. Hundreds of miles east, at the site the Chinese call Xiaohe, excavators uncovered a male burial that stopped the team cold. The man stood over 6 feet tall, with a full reddish-brown beard, dating to roughly 1000 BCE. He was buried in a crimson tunic and deerskin boots, with several hats of different styles placed beside him. Stranger still were the 3 women and an infant arranged alongside him in the grave, positioned as if keeping watch over him in death. Near the oasis town of Turfan, at a site called Sebeshi, 2 women were found in graves dating to around 400 BCE. Each wore a towering black conical hat nearly 3 feet tall, far too elaborate to be a practical garment. Their faces were partially covered by woven textile masks, and their clothing was decorated with complex geometric patterns. Whatever ritual meaning those hats carried died with them. Archaeologists called them the Witches of Sebeshi, and the name captured something real. These people followed traditions that matched nothing else in ancient China. By the early 2000s, systematic excavation had cataloged more than 200 mummies spread across burial sites spanning nearly 1,000 miles of the Tarim Basin. They ranged in date from roughly 2100 BCE to 200 BCE, nearly 2,000 years of continuous occupation. The extreme dry heat had preserved them so completely that scientists could still analyze hair color, run isotope studies on their teeth, and identify what these people had eaten in the weeks before their deaths. The evidence kept compounding, and none of it made sense. The clothing was as puzzling as the faces. Wool fabrics recovered from the burials were woven in diagonal twill and plaid patterns, textile techniques associated with early Indo-European cultures across Europe and Central Asia, not with anything from ancient Chinese civilization. Archaeologist Elizabeth Barber, who published a landmark study of these textiles, concluded they matched weaving traditions from the steppes and bore striking resemblance to early Celtic cloth. No Chinese parallel to this textile technology existed. In 2014, scientists published an analysis of organic residues found associated with several mummies from the Xiaohe Cemetery. The substance, identified through lipid analysis, was a fermented dairy product, effectively a Bronze Age kefir cheese dating to roughly 1600 BCE. Some of it appeared to have been worn directly on the body as a personal item. It ranked among the earliest confirmed preserved dairy products ever found anywhere in the world, and it told researchers these people maintained sophisticated herding and fermentation practices that took generations to develop. Linguists had their own reason to be baffled. Among manuscripts recovered from caves and ruins across the Tarim Basin, found by early 20th century expeditions, including those led by Oral Stein, was an extinct language called Tocharian. It was unambiguously Indo-European, a cousin of Latin, Sanskrit, and Ancient Greek. Yet it had been written here, in western China, at least 1,000 years after the oldest mummies. The presence of an Indo-European language this far east had no accepted explanation, and the deeper researchers looked, the more the Tarim Basin seemed to defy every known model of ancient migration. By the 1990s, the mummies had become politically explosive. Xinjiang is home to the Uyghur people, a Turkic Muslim minority with a deeply contested relationship with Chinese state authority. Some Uyghur nationalists cited the mummies as proof of ancient non-Chinese settlement, strengthening territorial claims. Chinese authorities restricted international research access and slowed the publication of findings. For years, the intersection of identity politics and archaeology suppressed the very science that could answer the question. When Western researchers were permitted to analyze samples, the dominant hypothesis pointed to the Yamnaya, Bronze Age pastoralists from the Pontic-Caspian steppe in what is now Ukraine and southern Russia. The Yamnaya had expanded dramatically around 3000 BCE, spreading their genes and Proto-Indo-European language east and west across Eurasia with remarkable speed. A branch of that expansion pushing deep into Central Asia, the argument went, could plausibly have reached the Tarim Basin and left these tall, light-haired descendants behind. A competing theory centered on the Afanasevo culture, a Bronze Age society from the Altai Mountains and Minyasinsk Basin, the borderlands of modern Russia, Kazakhstan, and Mongolia. The Afanasevo, who flourished between roughly 3,500 and 2,500 BCE, carried early Yamnaya-related ancestry and are considered among the first known Indo-European groups to push into Inner Asia. Their geographic range placed them close enough to the Tarim Basin that a migration seemed not just possible, but likely. But the genetic data, when it finally arrived, ruled them out completely. Early attempts at genetic analysis in the 1990s and 2000s only deepened the confusion. Limited ancient DNA extracted from the mummies showed markers associated with both Western and Eastern Eurasian populations, but matching no known group cleanly. The signals pointed in multiple directions simultaneously. Each new round of analysis contradicted the last. These people were genetically distinctive in a way that the technology of the era simply could not resolve, and the mystery grew heavier with every inconclusive result. The breakthrough required going to the oldest burials. In 2003, a Chinese-led expedition armed with Folke Bergmann's rediscovered 1934 field notes relocated the Xiaohe Cemetery, also known as Small River Cemetery, which had been lost to science since the original Swedish survey. What the team uncovered was extraordinary. More than 300 graves stacked in layers across a low sand dune, each marked by a tall wooden pole carved to a point or paddle shape. The oldest burials, at the very bottom, dated to roughly 2000 BCE. The cemetery had been in continuous use for centuries. The burial ritual at Xiaohe was meticulous and strikingly consistent across centuries. Bodies were wrapped in cattle hide and sealed inside wooden coffins shaped like upturned boats. Male graves were marked with tall carved phalluses, female graves with paddle-shaped posts. Baskets containing wheat, bundles of ephedra, a stimulant plant, and cattle bones accompanied each burial. The same ritual had been followed generation after generation with no variation, across hundreds of years, in a desert where everything else was constantly changing. In October 2021, a paper published in the journal Nature changed everything. An international research team had extracted and sequenced ancient DNA from 13 individuals drawn from the oldest layers of Xiaohe and the nearby Gumegu Cemetery, with burials radiocarbon dated to between 2100 and 1700 BCE. It was the most comprehensive genomic analysis of the earliest Tarim Basin population ever completed. When the results came back, they invalidated every existing theory at once. The mummies showed virtually no genetic ancestry from the Yamnaya, the Afanasevo, or any other Bronze Age steppe population. They were not migrants from the Near East, not wanderers from Central Asia, and not a displaced eastern branch of any Western group. Instead, their DNA was overwhelmingly derived from a lineage geneticists call Ancient North Eurasians, a population known primarily through a 24,000-year-old individual excavated near Lake Baikal in Siberia at a site called Malta. That individual had been in the ground for 24 millennia. The Tarim mummies were carrying his lineage in almost undiluted form, thousands of years later. Ancient North Eurasians are what geneticists call a ghost population, a lineage identified through ancient DNA that left no surviving pure-line descendants anywhere in the modern world. They ranged across northern Eurasia tens of thousands of years ago and contributed ancestry to Native Americans, South Asians, and Europeans. But by the Bronze Age, their signal was thought to have been diluted beyond recognition by admixture with other groups. The Tarim people were carrying this lineage in concentrated form at least 4,000 years ago, in a desert no one else had thought to look. More astonishing than the ancestry was the isolation. The Tarim mummies showed essentially zero genetic admixture with neighboring populations across the entire 1,500-year span of their occupation in the basin. No Yamnaya genes entered from the west. No East Asian genes filtered in from the east. Despite living adjacent to emerging trade routes, despite potentially exchanging goods with neighboring cultures, they remained genetically sealed. This degree of isolation sustained across that time span has almost no parallel in Bronze Age genomic records anywhere on Earth. When did the Tarim people's ancestors arrive, and how? The genomic clock places their divergence from the main ancient North Eurasian lineage somewhere between 9,000 and 7,000 years ago, well before the Bronze Age migrations that reshaped the rest of Eurasia. The researchers concluded their ancestors likely entered the Tarim Basin during a wetter, more habitable climatic period in the early Holocene. As the climate dried over subsequent millennia and the desert expanded, they became encircled. The environment that trapped them ultimately preserved them. Despite their isolation, the Tarim people built a materially sophisticated civilization. They raised cattle and sheep, maintained dairy herds capable of producing fermented cheese, and cultivated wheat. Evidence of cart tracks at multiple sites confirms they constructed wheeled vehicles. Their bronze tools were technically accomplished. Their plaid textiles required multi-generational accumulated knowledge of loom construction, fiber preparation, and dyeing. By every material measure, they were not a struggling fringe group. They were a functioning, well-organized society. The Tocharian language puzzle now fits into a coherent picture. Tocharian is classified as one of the most archaic branches of the Indo-European language family, having diverged from the root lineage at a very early point on the tree. If the Tarim people's ancestors split from the main ancient North Eurasian group 7,000 to 9,000 years ago, they may have carried an early form of Proto-Indo-European speech from the very beginning, preserving a linguistic fossil in the desert just as the sand preserved their bodies. The isolated genetic signal fades from the record around 500 BCE, coinciding with intensifying contact between the Tarim oasis cities and surrounding powers, the Xiongnu nomadic confederation expanding from the north, followed by Han Dynasty forces pushing west along what would become the Silk Road. By the 2nd century BCE, when Chinese imperial historians began writing detailed accounts of the Tarim kingdoms, the original ancient North Eurasian genetic profile had already been substantially diluted by outside admixture. A cultural echo survived far longer than the genes. Tocharian manuscripts written between the 5th and 8th centuries AD preserve an Indo-European language still alive in the Tarim cities of Kucha and Turfan, used for Buddhist texts, trade records, and poetry. The last known Tocharian speakers were gradually absorbed into Turkic-speaking populations around the 9th century AD. The language that may have begun with the earliest Tarim mummies outlasted its original speakers by roughly 1,000 years. The ancient North Eurasian lineage itself did not disappear. It dispersed across the world in smaller fractions. It contributes roughly 40% of the ancestry of modern Native Americans, carried by Siberian populations that crossed the Bering Land Bridge. It flows into modern South Asians and Central Asians and contributes a detectable share to modern Europeans. The Tarim mummies were the last surviving concentrated expression of this lineage, a relic population that held on in the desert while the rest of the world moved on without them. The 2021 Nature study covered only 13 individuals from the oldest cemetery layers. Hundreds of additional Tarim mummies have yet to be fully sequenced under modern protocols. Ongoing research is examining DNA from burials across later time periods to trace exactly how and when the Ane lineage was absorbed and replaced. Each new genome is expected to add granularity to a story spanning at least 9,000 years, and researchers believe several more major revisions to the prehistory of Central Asia are still waiting in the sand. What the Tarim discovery overturns is a tidy narrative of Bronze Age history as an unbroken story of migration and population replacement. The standard model assumed that peoples in motion constantly absorbed or displaced earlier groups. The Tarim Basin people demonstrate something different, that extreme environments can act as genetic preserves, holding ancient lineages in place for centuries while massive migrations sweep through the surrounding world. The desert was not a barrier to civilization, it was a time capsule for one. One question the genomic data cannot fully answer is whether the Tarim people were the original carriers of the Tocharian language or whether they acquired it through cultural contact with another group while keeping their genes intact. Genetics and language do not always travel together. Resolving this requires ancient DNA from neighboring regions and older sites, data that multiple research teams are actively working to produce. The answer, when it comes, will likely force another rewrite of the Indo-European language origin story. The mummies in China's desert turned out to be none of the things early theories proposed. Not Celtic wanderers, not Yamnaya herders, not any known Western group. They were remnants of a lineage older than all of those. A ghost population that survived the last ice age, settled in one of the world's harshest environments, and endured for 2,000 years while empires rose and fell at the edges of their desert. The Taklamakan kept their secret for 4 millennia. A single genomic study cracked it open in 2021, and the answer was stranger and more ancient than anything anyone had predicted. If a people could maintain a distinct civilization in complete genetic isolation for 1,500 years, hidden in one of Earth's most hostile deserts, carrying an ancient language and a textile tradition that left no local parallel, it raises a question worth sitting with. How many other forgotten lineages are still out there, preserved in extreme environments, waiting for the right technology to find them? Leave your answer in the comments below.